Hey everybody, this is Aaron from Aaron's Audio Corner, and I'm going to do something a little bit different than I've done in the past, and this is actually due to a lot of your suggestions. When I was on my little bit of a hiatus, I had some trouble kind of getting back into the swing of things, and I made a couple comments about that, and a lot of you suggested that I try just doing some updates. And I thought, that's a pretty good idea, and over the past couple weeks, I've seen a few things that have come out that I thought about making a video and just discussing, more like an off the cuff. Here are my thoughts on it. Don't take it for, much more than what it's worth, just the actual word value. Genelec has released, as of today, I suppose it'll be their flagship model. It's the 8381A, and it is a behemoth of a loudspeaker. And so I thought I would take the time to kind of go through the specs with you guys, look at it, maybe just discuss again my own thoughts just off the top. And I really want to make sure that I preface this entire video with the statement that, look, I don't know anything more than what I'm about to talk about right now. I don't have any insider knowledge. I don't have a press release. I don't have anything. Whatever I'm about to go through is the same thing that you can access through Genelec's website. And I will link their website in the description below if you want to follow up. So with that said, I'm going to flip over to their website and I'm just going to roll through this. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to ask. Maybe Genelec will reach out to me and provide me some information on your own comments or questions, but I'm not really going to hold my breath. But feel free to knock yourself out. Leave me a comment below if you have any questions. And also let me know if you like this format. Let's go. They're running a coaxial driver. So that's a mid-range, and a tweeter inside. And then check out these 4 dome looking things. What the heck are those? Are those buttons that you can push? No, they're actually mid-ranges. And if you read through the manufacturer's data, they talk about how these are mid-ranges that cover a little bit of the lower mid-range portion. This down here is their mid-woofer. And then these down here, there's 2, one on each side, are going to be their subwoofers. Now, the thing that I find very interesting about this particular speaker is, again, you've got this coaxial driver right in the middle. That coaxial driver is basically horn loaded, right? It's got a waveguide, and you can even see the circumference of the waveguide is actually a circle, thus circumference, instead of a square or a rectangle or an ellipsoid, or maybe, I guess, more spherical than circular. But you see the shape that I'm talking about here. Now, this mid-range plays down to in the neighborhood of about 500 hertz. And then each of these dome mid-ranges played, I think, from about ballpark, about 250 to 500 hertz. And we'll get into this a little bit more in the specs. The way that this is set up, according to Genelec, is that these mid-ranges are also coaxially integrated with this coaxial mid-range this mid-range and tweeter. So in other words, the spacing of these dome mid-ranges relative to the actual coaxial driver is within the wavelength of the crossover to where it's one point source. So even though they're not physically co-located, each of these mids is co-located acoustically with the coaxial speaker. I talked about this being a behemoth, and we can see down here the dimensions: 14, 50, 500 millimeters. I don't do millimeters. I'm just a poor, dumb engineer in the United States. So let's flip over to inches. All right. 57 inches tall, 19 inches wide, and 27 inches deep. 57 inches tall. So that's pretty darn tall. I mean, what is that? Like maybe down here to me or so. And I'm about 5'11", give or take, just depending on if I stand on my toes or not, or squat down. Now, why I probably won't ever have this speaker, they haven't come out with an MSRP yet. Matter of fact, they've said they're not releasing that information yet. And I think they encourage you to go to your dealer and talk to them. But on the forums and on the Facebook groups and on Twitter, people are saying that the number for the pricing of this is going to be $70,000 per pair. Now, that does include amplifiers as well as the speakers themselves. So you buy a stereo pair and you get the amplifiers. And I think that also will include their equalization kit. So, I mean, it's not like you're not getting a heck of a lot of speaker, but I'll be honest, $70,000 is insane to me. And I'm not saying that this speaker is not worth it. I'm just saying my cost of living relative to the cost of this speaker is never going to happen. And the interesting thing that kind of makes me perk up a little bit when I see that price and then I see this speaker, Danley Sound Labs, they've got their Hyperion speaker, which I did a video on almost 2 years ago. I actually got to go to Danley's home headquarters in Georgia, and I got to demo that speaker myself. And that speaker also used two 15-inch woofers on the bottom, and it had a very similar shape to this particular speaker too. And matter of fact, let me pull that up real fast. Okay, after much Googling, I found a picture of it. So you can see that there's a lot of similarities in terms of just the overall aesthetic. I mean, the speakers aren't gorgeous by any stretch of the imagination, at least in my opinion. They're very just more function over form. But you can see the similarity between this Danley Hyperion versus, again, this new Genelec 8381. Now, they're not the same speaker. They don't work on the same premise, but just in terms of looks alone. The last time I think I heard a MSRP for the Danley Hyperion, I want to say, and this, I've not had this verified, but I want to say it was like $30,000 to $40,000, but let's say it's 50. Well, it's still not 70. And so there's a big difference in price. And I can tell you firsthand that those Danleys got ridiculously loud and they sounded incredibly awesome. So personally speaking, without having the ability to listen to this 8381A by Genelec versus that Danley Hyperion, I'm going to default to the Danley Hyperion because I've heard it. I know what it sounds like, and I just don't see how much else could beat it. That said, this speaker could sound better. It's totally plausible. That's kind of the design of this new Genelec, you know, in just extreme summation. But what I want to look at now is the manufacturer's spec sheet that they provided. And Genelec does a really good job about providing you with actual data. So I want to focus on that a little bit as well. All right, now we've got the manual up off Genelec's site, and you see another photograph of their speaker here. And, you know, again, I don't think it's a gorgeous looking speaker, but it's a really neat looking speaker just because the engineer in me, in my past life, I was a test propulsion engineer. And so when I see this graphic, I just think, you know, it looks like attitude control motors and a thruster in the middle. I can't help but see that. Or so maybe Star Wars geeks might see an X-Wing. Who knows? But that's what I see. And I just kind of, I don't know. I think it's cool. Here's another photo from the side in their manual. And now we are down to some of their highlights for their specs. It's a 5-way design, almost 6,000 watts of amplifier power for, I believe that's just the one speaker, 6,000 watts. I can only imagine that this is Class D. I can't imagine this being anything other than that, but I don't know. 129 dB per pair maximum output. Now, this is the one thing about manufacturers that kind of leaves me in a lurch. 129 dB. Well, we know SPL is relative. If I'm standing right next to you, I'm going to be louder than I am further away. So when they say 129 dB, I wonder what distance that is. Is that at 1 meter? Is that at 10 meters? I don't know. They don't tell me that. I wish they would. Frequency range 20 hertz to 35 kilohertz. On-axis response linearity plus or minus 1.5 dB. If they're talking within 20 to 35 kilohertz, plus or minus 1.5 dB, let's just assume this thing can get extremely loud, regardless of if it's 129 dB at 5 meters or 10 meters or 15. We're looking at this speaker. It's got two 15s built into it, and I'm guessing this is a 15-inch mid-woofer as well. We're going to know this thing can get loud. So with the maximum SPL capability of ridiculously loud for a home theater or most modern studios, this kind of on-axis accuracy is like awesome. Not just the accuracy, but the range that it's supposed to be able to play within. Minimum listening distance of 1 meter. So they're saying you can get up to 1 meter from this speaker and enjoy all of the fruits and labors. Now, the problem with most speakers that aren't a coaxial type design or a point source type design is if you have a tweeter and a mid-range and they're stacked on top of each other, you need to be far enough away for those two drivers to sum. And that would be the beauty in a coaxial design because those two drivers are already aligned together. And then this speaker is an extension of a coaxial design, whereas all one large point source, that's the design goal there. The weight is 75 kilograms, they say, for enclosure 1, enclosure 2. Now, I believe that this is enclosure 1 would be the bottom, the subwoofer portion. Enclosure 2 would be the top portion. 75 kilograms a piece. I'm going to Google that real fast. 75 kg2 LBS. That is 165 pounds. So each one of these sections weighs 165 pounds. Whoa, that's crazy. Here's some other specs that are interesting. The accuracy we've already discussed. Okay, accuracies, 30 hertz to 20 kilohertz, 1.5 dB. That's pretty freaking awesome. 20 hertz, 6 dB down. I don't really care about 35 hertz. That's like ultrasonic, and I'm still not convinced that any of that really matters above like 20 kilohertz, typical human listening range. Minimum latency, and then group delay, phase linearity. These are all cool things to have. The latency is helpful, you know, especially if you're doing like video monitoring. So you're watching something while you're adjusting audio to it. That's important to have. Let's see, crossover frequencies. It's 50 to 130 hertz variable, 150 to 250 hertz variable. And I'm assuming that this is your mid-range concentric, and this is your tweeter. So this variable part, now I did watch the video, and they did mention in the video that when you use their GLM, their room calibration software, that depending on the actual measured response in room, it will choose an appropriate crossover point. So you're not fixed at 150 hertz or 250 hertz. Your lower mid-range unit is going to be somewhere in that ballpark, and then your subwoofer to mid-woofer range is going to be in this 50 to 130 hertz. I think that's kind of neat. I'd really be curious to know how that works, but it's probably like way beyond my understanding, so I probably wouldn't get it anyway, but I would be curious to know. Maximum SPL. Okay. Let's see. Do they tell us? Mean SPL between 100 hertz, 3 kilohertz. Great information to have. THD is less than 10% below 200 hertz. THD is less than 3% above 200 hertz at 1 meter in half space. Okay, in half space. Let's talk about that. Half space means that if you have a speaker and you could go to the sky and float it like Superman and you can listen to it, that's full space. That's anechoic. Half space means as soon as you bring it to any boundary, one boundary, like on the ground, now you're in half space. So that adds 6 dB to the output. So basically what you could say is their maximum SPL short term is 126 minus 6, so 120 dB anechoic, just for what it's worth. 121 dB half space at 1 meter. So those are good things to know. And then when you add another speaker to it, you're going to get more output, and then you're going to get room gain as well. So normally I say you're anywhere from like 6 to 9 dB of adding another speaker, and you get room gain. So that's kind of where you're going to get extra output. 2 15-inch woofers. Front woofer is 15 inches, quad mid-range. So they're all 4 5-inch domes. Coaxial is a 5-inch, and then they say their tweeter is a 1-inch. Okay, and it's a compression tweeter, so cool. That means they can take the SPL. Most of the time when you're talking high SPL levels, one of two things is going to give up. Either it's going to be your woofer is just going to mechanically overexert itself, and you're going to fry a voice coil or just destroy the suspension, or you're going to fry the voice coil of the tweeter because the tweeter can't keep up. Normally, your mid-range area is going to be fine. So when they say it's a compression tweeter, that lets me know that that tweeter can handle the output, and then it doesn't make me question so much, at least, the maximum output capabilities that they've referenced here. They do have a list of their THD at different ranges and values. You can look that up on your own time. I'm going to focus on the frequency response measurements. And let's see here. On axis, looks quite linear to me. Looks like their spec is good. Going off axis, it's a good slope. But notice the one thing that I'm finding here is that there's this more extreme dip at about, 15-degree increments. So that's 0, 15, 30, 45, 60. So this is 60 degrees right here at the bottom. There's a more extreme dip around the 500 hertz region, and then coming back up around 1 kilohertz. So that means that the integration of those mid-ranges and I guess the coaxial driver is maybe not quite as good as it could be. But again, if we're looking at this scale, most of us are used to seeing a 50 dB scale. This scale is 25 dB. So I don't think it's going to be as big of an issue as this blown up scale looks like it might be. But it is interesting to note that there is a directivity error in that particular response range. Now, what is that going to make your room or your speaker sound like in your room? You know, without seeing a full set of spinorama, I couldn't really tell you. I could only venture a guess that maybe things might sound a little bit tinny in the 1 kilohertz area, just because there's more room interaction going on there compared to the mid range. Or you could flip it and say maybe things might sound a little bit hollow in the upper mid range, depending on, you know, how you hear things. I mean, most of the time when we're talking about sound, it's all relative. If you don't have a basis, if you don't have graphics, you can't say 500 hertz sounds lower than 1 kilohertz. Most people can't. So what you normally do is you say, well, this sounds like this. Well, this sounds like this because it's relative to this. So let's say you have tweeters that are turned up way too high. Some people might say it sounds harsh or fatiguing or bright or any of those other kind of terms. Well, they're not saying the mid-range sounds mellow or dull. They're saying this sounds bright. But somebody else could say, well, the mid-range sounded dull to me. And they could mean the exact same thing. This is why I think data is super, super important, because it cuts out the ambiguity to things. I cannot believe I said the word ambiguity the first time without fumbling it too, by the way. I don't know if y'all know, but my head just blew up like really big because I feel like I'm super smart because I said a cool big word. To me, I'm in Alabama. Ambiguity is a big word. Horizontal plane. This is the directivity, the contour response of the speaker. And this is the area that I also want to kind of note something about. And this is personal preference. When you have a dome tweeter on a flat baffle, normally what you get is you get about plus or minus maybe 70 to 80 degrees spread out into the room. And then around 8 kilohertz or so, that flat baffle wasn't really helping you anymore. So now the dome tweeter is just beaming on its own and there's no reinforcement from anything. So then the beam starts to narrow up and the directivity becomes much more narrow in the higher frequencies. That's the bad thing about tweeters just on a flat baffle with no waveguide, no horn, anything like that. When you add a horn or a waveguide to a tweeter or a compression driver, you are taking that sound profile and you're kind of forcing the lower frequencies like inward, and that matches up with the higher frequencies. And then you have a more smooth, controlled directivity. But in doing that, you also narrow up the radiation pattern. And I've seen anywhere typical ranges be from like plus or minus 30 degrees to plus or minus 50 degrees. That's coaxials and that's horn designs. From KEF, from Genelec, from JBL, from Rendall to you name it, generally speaking, that's what I see. There are some exceptions, but that's generally what I see. That narrowing and radiation, or that more narrow radiation profile, is something that I genuinely just don't necessarily care for. I generally prefer a wider radiating speaker. So when I look at this result and I see that their -6 dB point, so this lighter green, is about 45 degrees, plus or minus 45 degrees, I know based on my own listening from numerous speakers and then seeing the data, I know that I'm probably not going to enjoy the speaker as much as I would if it were plus or minus 60 or plus or minus 70. If this light green extended out to here, I would probably enjoy it more because that gives you more room interaction, that gives you more boundary reflections, and it makes things sound a little bit more wide. But the trade-off to that, the trade-off from having a wide radiating speaker to a more narrow radiating speaker, let's assume both of are constant directivity, so it's constantly narrowing or it's constantly staying wide. The trade-offs there is that when you have a more narrow radiating sound, there's less room interaction, and that means that you typically will have more precise imaging. If there is a singer, or if there's a harpsichord, or there's a sax, or something that's very precise, it'll be more precise in the soundstage. Somewhere in that soundstage, it's going to be more precise, as opposed to a wider radiating speaker that's going to have more room interaction and maybe even more envelopment, or what's the word I'm looking for here? I guess interaction with the other speaker as well. So the room and the other speaker, they're kind of overlapping a little bit. Generally, what I find is that the precision of the images in the soundstage are not quite as precise. So instead of like being like, dude, it's right here, that somebody's hitting the cowbell and it's like right here. What you then get is it sounds like this. So it's like, it's terrible, but hopefully you understand what I'm talking about. So that's kind of my take on seeing the horizontal plane radiation stuff. This video has run a little bit longer than I really intended it to, but they've got a lot of great information in these brochures. And I really just wanted to take the time to go through and explain, like, when I look at stuff, when I look at data and when I see new products come out, what am I looking for? And it's fun to share this stuff and talk about it and hypothesize and things like that. With that said, I think I'm going to cut out on this video. And do me a favor, if you like this kind of content where I'm just kind of free flowing things and talking about stuff as I see it, please let me know. Leave a thumbs up, because that is a good indication to me if you like it. And if you don't, for some reason, feel free to leave a thumbs down. I will see those metrics and it will give me a better idea of if something like this is useful to you. If you are new to the channel and you're interested in stuff like this, please consider subscribing and hit that notification bell so you'll be updated when I decide to do videos like this. I appreciate you all watching. I hope you learned something, and I hope maybe it triggered a little bit of thoughts in your mind. I know it certainly did mine. Just talking about this stuff and having discussion, even if it's one-sided, helps me a lot to understand things, because then I can start to rationalize it and I can start to think about the different aspects of it. And I hope really that opened up some ideas or some doorways for you if you're somewhat new to the hobby, but you really dig it and you find this stuff interesting. That's it for me today. I will talk to you all later. Take care. I'm out. Peace.